Hi, and welcome to my speculative short fiction roundup for April 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. And this month, I've got 17 great stories to share with you that I read in April. And I sort of especially want to highlight some things before I get started, and that is you should definitely check out the new issues of Anathema magazine, Fire magazine, and Mythila Review. This past month, I also read the zine Constellation for the first time, and I was hugely impressed by the quality of the stories and the writing. Long story short, there are so many great zines, so many great stories, and so many great writers out there. So let's get started with this month's roundup. And if there are bird noises in the background or dog noises in the background, I do apologize, but I am late already with this roundup, and I'm just going to go for it, even if there are dog noises and bird noises. So, my first story this month is An Explorer's Cartography of Already Settled Lands by Fran Wild at Tor.com. This is a science fiction story, sort of cloaked in fantasy to me, that gleams with all the richness and beauty and shadowy depths of a poem. And it's powerful and mesmerizing from beginning to end, like all of Wild's writing. As a ship arrives in a world that is already inhabited, the navigator on board sets out to explore the lands before the crew can disembark. But the world he is exploring keeps changing, and so do the people in it. And the maps the navigator makes says as much about what the navigator is looking for as for what the navigator actually finds. And I feel like this story talks about how, in the end, what you find and what you seek will change you in the process. As the intro to the story says, one can't set a course without a map. A ship's navigator seeks to map a world already inhabited in order to find a space for their ship's passengers to settle. In doing so, they find their course altered as the world and their place in it changes. My next story is When Hope is Lost, Touch Remains by Nin Harris in Podcast. And I'll start with a quote from the story. One night, she discovered how to pull a man's soul through his skin. It was an accidental, involuntary thing, birthed in a stray moment of hope. I absolutely adore this story. It's about a woman called Maria, who possesses a power she didn't know she had, that she then discovers in this moment of intimacy. And her power is connected to secrets in her own past and in her family's past. And I love how Harris unfolds the answers to all the mysteries slowly and deliberately with masterful skill. Most of all, to me, this is a story about how we choose to live our lives, how we choose to use whatever powers we have, and how the paths we took and did not take can come back to haunt us years later. Harris's prose is exquisite, and the story has an earthy, sensual vibe that is just marvelously seductive, just like Maria herself, and wonderful narration by Chang Yun Yi. My next story is Air Body by Samim Siddiqui in Clarkesworld. In Siddiqui's story, there is a new gig economy app called AirBody that allows people to inhabit the body of another person for a set period of time. The narrator of the story is somewhat surprised when he sees the profile of his latest client, because why would a middle-aged Pakistani auntie want to rent a man's body in a different country? It seems to have something to do with cooking initially, but beyond that, he really has no idea why she'd want to use him. This is a slyly funny and emotionally satisfying story that plays around a lot with the archetypes and expectations we might have about other people. And it's also about love. And it's a terrific story. You should definitely read it. Sorry about the dog. My next story is 3 Days with the Kid by Tara Kalabi in Strange Horizons. This is a post-apocalyptic tale with additional dog barking about two people who find each other in the arid wilds of Australia and travel through the harsh landscape in search of shelter and water. Calabi's tense and taut story uses many of the common post-apocalyptic tropes, but there's a fresh perspective here and some great twists and some fantastic characters that makes it really spark with emotion. I love stories that pair up a tough kid with a gritty older person. Hello, aliens. And this story fits right in my sweet spot. My next story is Uniform by Eric Nunnally in Faya number 14. And this story is part of the excellent new issue of Faya. It's about a soldier who is horribly injured in combat, has had his body fused and integrated with various tech upgrades, so that on the outside he looks too much like a machine for most people to treat him like a person, but on the inside his human strengths and frailties are battered by being set aside and mistreated by the country and the people he sacrificed so much for. It's an incisive and gripping story that deals with heroism and sacrifice without becoming jingoistic or sentimental. It's an excellent read, and I do apologize for this barking dog in the background. My next story is The Least of These by Veronica Roth in Light Speed. Two women wake up in a future ravaged by plague and Two women in a future ravaged by plague and disaster wake up in a strange house where two aliens ask them to help save humanity, or rather, a limited number of humans. To quote the aliens, "We do not wish to cull your population indiscriminately. We wish to collect the best and brightest of your people. But who should determine the parameters for such a collection? It cannot be us. It must be you." End quote. This is a science fiction parable of sorts, with Roth putting her own twist on the famous trolley problem. I really like this for the stylish prose and for the characters, both aliens and humans, who do not act as you might expect in this kind of story. My next story is Getaway by Nicole Corner-Stass in Uncanny Magazine. And I start with a quote from the story after I close the door so that the dog won't bark so much. Just one second. So here's a quote from the story. "If this were a movie, you're pretty sure you'd have more options. More than 15 minutes between idling car and dead Janelle and broken artifact and reset. It'd just make for better filmmaking." So the thing about this story is there's a narrator stuck in a time loop, reliving different iterations of the same heist over and over again. No matter what she tries, things always end either badly or worse than badly. There's a mysterious artifact involved, but what I mostly love about this story is the exasperated and foul-mouthed voice of the narrator as she tries to figure out how to make it stop. It's a great spin on one of my favorite sci-fi tropes. Next up is Endless Parade by Haley Piper in Flash Fiction Online. In a post-apocalyptic, harsh and unforgiving world, a group of humans traverse the landscape, chasing after a being they call Mother Ceremonium. They ravage and plunder the areas they move through, displacing or killing whoever they deem to be slothful, meaning that they're not part of the parade. And this is a sharp, raw story with an ending that gutted me. Next up is Falling Through by Steen Comer in Escape Pod. There's a quiet desperation in this story about a man who seems to be unstuck in the multiverse, slipping through the fabric of time and space into different versions of his own life. There's a quiet tension of a man who is basically going about his business as best he can while reality changes around him that makes this story so darn good. There's a love story, too, that is heart-tugging, yet beautifully understated as well. I feel as if Comer manages to capture both the familiar feeling we all might have at times, that we're not sure of how and if we fit into our own lives. And also that weirdness of what it would be like to actually slip through realities. It's wonderful, poignant science fiction and great narration by Roderick Oust. Next up are two stories from Constellation magazine. The first one is The Catafalque by Vaira Chandrasekhara in Constellation. What if the afterlife was a virtual reality construct? What if you could choose your heaven and have it play out for you like a predetermined story? But what if there was also a certain amount of red tape involved? This story plays with those concepts, and it plays out in a bleak, seemingly post-apocalyptic landscape with a narrator who is doing their best to escape death and damnation, while also trying to find an agreeable post-death existence. The next story from Constellation that I want to recommend is Dutiful Daughter by Joyce Ching. And I'll start with a quote. She was a dutiful Chinese daughter, obeying her father's wishes, putting his needs before her own. She wanted him to be proud of her accomplishments. She wanted him to smile and praise her. In this gorgeously wrought and surreal story, a woman works hard and diligently to change herself in order to please her father, to get him to really see her and pay attention to her. And what she does to herself in the process, the specific way that she alters herself, is terrifying, beautiful, and also devastating. I love how the writer tells this really very strange tale in such a strong yet subtle way, and while making you feel both the longing and the power that this woman carries inside her. My next story recommendation is The Breaking by Vanessa Fogg in Mythula Review. It's a wonderful story by Vanessa Fogg from a great new issue of Mythula Review. There's a strange apocalypse happening in the world. I seem to be including a lot of apocalyptic stuff this month. I don't know if it's just my brain on the pandemic or what it is. Anyway, so there's a strange apocalypse happening in the world that started with the arrival of so-called angels, though they don't seem very heavenly to the narrator or her brother. There's a lovely, enigmatic, and ominous threat looming at the heart of the story, and Fogg tells it in a quietly powerful way. There's a world here that is changing, but change has been held back for a decade as the strange beings that have arrived stay behind the barrier, but something is changing. Highly recommend. Highly recommend this story. Sorry about that microphone problem here. My next story is A Promise of Dying Embers by Jordan Corella in Diabolical Plots. It's about a young woman who has trained for years to defeat a dragon in battle. Now she is on a dangerous quest headed for the dragon's cave, and she carries the bones of her dead uncle with her, and her purpose is to break an old curse. It's a story about magic and dragons. It's about finding your purpose in life, and it's also very much about love. Prose is gorgeous, and I really like how the story carefully twists and turns the complex and fraught relationship between two very powerful individuals. And I also love how the narrator finds her own way to complete the quest. My next story is Little Free Library by Naomi Kritzer in Tor.com. So when Megan moves to St. Paul, she sets up a little free library. Soon she realizes that a very book-hungry and curious individual is borrowing the books she puts there, including a whole lot of excellent speculative fiction. And this person seems to be taking a great interest in everything there is to learn from the books, too. To quote, "All my prayers were answered the day I found your library, and I will forever be your servant, librarian of the books of the tree. We have begun constructing a ballista in secret. Please send me more books." This is a wonderful, clever, satisfying story about the power of books and how what we read and what we share with other readers can have an importance beyond what we might have originally considered. Next up is Oh, How She Danced by Sandra Odell in Kaleidotrope. I love Sandra Odell's writing, and the way they combine whimsy and darkness in many of their stories, telling tales that are simultaneously unsettling and emotionally powerful is just, I love it. In the story, we find ourselves in an unusual world inhabited by strange characters and creatures, and when the end of that world comes, it's not exactly the usual kind of apocalypse. Next up is Otto Hahn Speaks to the Dead by Octavia Cade in the Dark. Octavia Cade weaves together science, history, and fiction in this gruesomely dark and bone-chilling horror tale from the dark. Otto Hahn was a famous German chemist who, among other things, worked with fellow scientist Fritz Haber to develop chlorine gas, which was used by Germany in World War I with devastating results. In Cade's story, Hahn is literally haunted by the ghost of Haber's wife, Clara Immerwahr, who was also a chemist and who died by suicide in 1915. This story is strong stuff, and it delves into issues of guilt and culpability and how a person's choices can reverberate through the world, impacting their own life as well as the lives of others in ways they might not have bargained for. Also, if you want to read more of Cade's excellent prose, check out her novel, The Stone Weta. My last story pick for this month is The Future in Salt Water by Tamara Jarrett in Anathema number 10. And I'm going to start with a quote from the story. The god turned a soothing shade of black upon touching me for the first time and wrapped its 8 suckered arms securely around my forearm. The bulbous mantle of its body flattened as it sunk the needle of its beak into the soft flesh of my inner elbow. I winced. In a world where the climate and environment have been ravaged, a child receives a difficult quest from the strange tentacled deity in the local temple. That might seem like run-of-the-mill opening for a speculative fiction story, but here things soon take a different and more harrowing turn than at least I expected, as the child resists and even refuses the call. After all, it's not easy to just pick up and leave when you have responsibilities at home, including a sickly parent to care for. I love the rich and deep world building that flows through the story, and I love how Jarrett twists and turns the concept of quests and sacrifice, ending up with a story that puts a new spin on the idea of a chosen one. There you go. You can find everything in writing at curiousfictions.com, and thank you so much for listening.